Throughout the course of the next 2 days, we're going to go up and down this Broncos roster because there are different expectations this year than there were last year, but the roster primarily is the same. So I'm curious to know if the perception about their intentions with some of these personnel groups are also the same. I want to start with their skill positions. You brought it up, so let's start there. Wide receivers, and we'll just start wide receivers, tight ends. We're going to play good plan, bad plan. So with the understanding that this is a developmental year and that results and the final record isn't the be-all, end-all this year, at least I assume, based upon our previous conversation, you would agree with that statement. What do you feel about their plan with the wide receiver room? As it stands right now, at least the depth chart heading into camp would presumably be Courtland Sutton, Marvin Mims, and then third – Tim Patrick or Josh Reynolds?
Josh Reynolds. I think that's the guy that you got to plan for anyway, right? I mean, you can't plan on it being Tim Patrick. We haven't seen him in 2 years. He's been injured. So I think that's the plan right now, those three guys. And then, obviously, like you said, you got Tim Patrick in the mix. You got Troy Franklin in the mix. Devon Vele, the seventh-rounder, is in the mix. Now you go back to some of the guys that were around last year, like Lil Jordan Humphrey, Brandon Johnson, Jalen Virgil, those types of guys, Philip Dorsett. Then you got a couple other guys, and David Sills, Michael Bandy. Yeah, he was around last year.
Yeah, he was. A little slot receiver. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's pretty much your group there, right? And what I do like here is the youth. And I like the fact that you got Marvin Mims going to get some playing time. I like Troy Franklin's potential. Fourth rounder, played with Bo Nix. Devon Vele, I've heard nothing but great things about him. So, seventh rounder, I'm not expecting a lot from him, but he's going to be a special teams guy. He's going to make this football team, and we'll see if he can contribute at the wide receiver position.
Can I stop you right there,
Yeah.
though? You just said Devon Vele is going to make this football team.
I did.
And by the way, when I saw him out at minicamp, big body, I mean, impressive. You can see the potential there with Devon Vele. And I saw him at Utah. I mean, he can play. So I agree with you. You talked about Mims, and you also did you mention Franklin? I'm not sure if you mentioned Franklin.
Yes, I did.
Okay, so Franklin and Vele. You've got some youth there, along with the Brandon Johnson, the Jalen Virgil. But the difference is you've got some youth there that you drafted, right? I mean, Brandon Johnson, Jalen Virgil, those guys were undrafted. I mean, Jalen Virgil wasn't drafted, was he? No, he was undrafted because he was the kid out of App State, wasn't it? I mean, and then he got hurt. He got hurt the beginning of last year. But the year before, we talked about, hey, look, he's got some speed why don't you get this guy on the field a little bit more? But I think you have the most competition, or arguably the most competition, at this position offensively. You could probably throw running back into the mix in that conversation. But as far as wide receiver, you just mentioned Vele. So how many receivers do you think out of this group they keep, 5 or 6?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends. Training camp, I mean, at the minimum, you're keeping 5. Right? I mean, you're keeping Courtland, Josh, Marvin, Troy Franklin.
Devon Vele. You said they're keeping him. So that's 5 off the hop right there.
Exactly. So you got one more spot possibly. Possibly. Maybe not. But that doesn't take in consideration injuries.
So let me ask you this.
So, if you're in that room right now and one of those guys you're kind of hoping that one of these guys get injured if you're Brandon Johnson, Virgil, somebody like that, to possibly open up a spot for you.
And see, this is the thing, is like normally we could say, okay, at least the last couple of years, there's nobody really beyond Sutton and Judy, and then Patrick got hurt. But beyond that, nobody was really set in stone except for when they drafted Mims. Well, now, seems to me like most of this receiver room is actually kind of set. I mean, they're not getting rid of Sutton. I mean, I guess they could.
That's the other question. Here's the Sutton situation.
Right.
How does this play out in training camp? Now, he showed up for minicamp, didn't want to lose $100,000, so that tells me he's going to show up. I mean, he showed up for minicamp. Yeah, that tells me he's going to show up for training camp.
Yeah,
because he doesn't want to get fined, $30-something thousand a day or whatever it is for training camp. So I'm expecting him to show up. What does it look like with him? Could you see a situation where you get at the end of the camp and the Broncos love their other receivers? Tim Patrick is stepping up and completely healthy, and you like a Jalen Virgil type of receiver, and you want to keep Jalen Virgil on the roster also, and you look at Sutton and the money he's making, let's trade him.
Well, I mean, you could also just cut him. You wouldn't, because you could get value in a trade, but because he's only got the $2 million guaranteed, I mean, you're not until that roster locks in, baby. I mean,
you could cut him. You absolutely could. I mean, I don't. You're like you said. I'm not expecting that to happen.
No,
you'll look to trade him and get some value for him.
Yeah, I mean,
but you could.
You'd accrue a dead cap hit, but I mean, as far as the guaranteed money you have to pay him, it's only 2. So my point is this: we're going to hear a lot of conversation about the competition in the receiver room, but I would wager to say they're going to keep 6 in this room, but you have to remember, if they're keeping 3 quarterbacks this year, which you and I both believe they do, that means either a receiver or an offensive lineman or defensive lineman doesn't make the team, because you got to be one short somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, that's
those would be the 3 positions, right? Receiver, O-line, D-line. Where you would say, okay, normally we could have 6 receivers, but since we're keeping 3 quarterbacks, we're just going to only keep 5 receivers. At some position, that decision will have to happen, whether it's line, up front, offensively or defensively.
Absolutely. And that's if you keep 6 receivers and 3 quarterbacks. I mean, you got to take away from somewhere else. And is it a cornerback? Is it offensive? Whatever the case may be. But just you mentioned Courtland's contract. You got a cap hit this year on Courtland's Sutton's contract of $17 million. Okay,
right.
If you cut him, you got a cap hit of $9 million.
Right.
So you actually could save $8 million on the cap if you cut him or trade him. So that's a big savings for him if they wanted to go down that road. If these other guys are stepping up, it's like, all right, you know what? We like these other guys. They're showing potential, and let's save a little money on the cap. You could save about $8 million if you moved on from Courtland Sutton. I'm not expecting them to do it. I don't think they'll do it, but
it's a possibility.
It's certainly a possibility here with some of these young wide receivers. Overall, if you're asking me, which I think you are, good plan or bad plan, the wide receiver room right now? Yeah? I think it's a good plan. I like this plan. I like these young guys. Like you mentioned, we got some drafted guys. I want to see what Marvin Mims looks like. I want to see Troy Franklin, Devon Vele. I want to see some of these young drafted wide receivers that have potential, and hopefully they can be, our Tank Dell, our Nico Collins, those guys for the Houston Texans that I never heard of before last year. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, man, those guys had a really good year. You saw Pittsburgh over the years, just like Emmanuel Sanders, Antonio Brown, Michael. I mean, these guys just come out of nowhere. They're just turning and burning all these wide receivers. Great talent there. I'm hoping that can become us, and these guys can grow with Bo Nix. So, but I like the plan right now.
I agree. I don't think it's a great plan, but I think it's a good plan for a team that is primarily in a developmental year. The one thing I want to say, the final thing here, I think they're going to keep 5, okay? They might end up going with 6. But that 6th spot is earmarked for Tim Patrick if he's healthy. If it's not, then I think we can have the conversation. Well, I mean, do you need Lil Jordan? Do you need Virgil? Do you need Brandon Johnson? Because I think those guys are all in the conversation. But Tim Patrick, if healthy, if he's got a good camp, for the love of God, if he can make it past the first day in pads, I think that 6th spot, that's his. On the other side,
I think you're spot on right there. I think you're all over it.